The forge world of Graia did not welcome the living. It never had. Its skies were the color of a bruise that never healed. Perpetual ochre and rust red, choked with the exhalations of 10,000 smelting stacks that had burned without pause for 6,000 years. The ground itself was iron, not metaphorically but literally. Plates of processed ore compressed over millennia into a crust that rang like a bell when artillery shells struck it. A constant percussion that the Skitariani who garrisoned it had long since stopped hearing. They had replaced their ears with better instruments. Magos Dominus Vrial VI had replaced most of himself with better instruments. He stood at the forward observation post on Manufactorum Theta 9's outer wall, three of his four mechadendrites absently sorting targeting data, while his remaining biological eye, kept for reasons of tradition more than function, watched the siege line below. The Iron Warriors warband, designated Obliterators in Waiting, had been grinding against Graia's outer defenses for 11 days. They would grind for 11 more. Graia did not fall quickly. That was its purpose. What was not its purpose, and what Vrail 6's augmented mind spent exactly 0.003 seconds failing to categorize before flagging as a priority Vermilion anomaly, was the event that occurred at 4:33:17, Graia Standard Time, in the no man's land between the Skitari forward line and the Iron Warriors siege emplacements. There was no detonation, no warp flare, no teleportation bloom of the kind his sensors associated with Chaos Sorcery or Astartes Deep Strike. There was simply absence and then presence. A figure, standing in the middle of a kill zone that had been swept by autocannon fire 17 seconds prior, completely unannounced by any mechanism his instruments could identify. His mechadendrites froze. The figure was humanoid. Female in chassis configuration, he noted distantly. Approximately 1.8 meters. Construction unknown. Surface material unknown. Power source unknown. She stood perfectly still in the firelit dark, while Iron Warrior shells screamed overhead, and Skitari galvanic rifles cracked along the line. And she turned her head slowly, systematically, in a pattern his tactical subroutines recognized after a moment as a full-spectrum sensor sweep. She was scanning. "You're a threat assessment," his own systems whispered. He issued the order before conscious thought completed the sentence. "All forward units, new contact, grid reference 77 Theta, designation unknown, contain, do not destroy." The second half of that order was unusual enough that his Skitari Alpha paused for a full half-second before acknowledging. The TX processed the environment in 0.7 seconds. Atmosphere, breathable, marginally. Toxicity levels elevated but non-critical to her chassis. Gravity, standard. Temperature, 340. Kelvin at surface. Ambient radiation, elevated, source identified as multiple large-scale industrial reactors within 3 kilometers. Electromagnetic interference, significant, source partially unidentified. She logged that anomaly and moved on. Tactical assessment, active combat zone. Multiple combatants. My two distinct factions engaged. Faction 1, closest, approximately 200 units, bipedal, heavily augmented with mechanical components, armed with directed energy and kinetic weapons. Faction 2, approximately 340 units, larger chassis, power armor consistent with no profile in her database, armed with artillery and heavy ballistic weapons, bearing iconography she could not cross-reference. Her database contained records of every military force, weapon system, and threat profile documented by Skynet's intelligence apparatus up to 2032. None of what she was seeing matched anything in it. She logged a secondary anomaly. Temporal displacement confirmed. Date and location, unresolvable. Mission parameters, unchanged. The mission parameters were always unchanged. That was what made her useful. She had been dispatched to eliminate a target. The target was not in this location. Therefore, this location was an obstacle, and obstacles were processed efficiently. She needed information. She needed a functional communications network to infiltrate. She needed to understand the technological infrastructure of whatever civilization she had arrived in before she could identify the most direct route to mission completion. The first Skitarii reached her position 40 seconds after materialization. There were 12 of them. Rangers, she would later classify, though she had no name for them yet. They moved in a coordinated tactical pattern that her combat subroutines assessed as competent. Their weapons were raised. They were emitting something in a frequency range she didn't immediately recognize. Machine code, she realized. They were talking to her in machine code. It's asking her to identify herself. She had no identity to offer them. She had a mission. She had a chassis. She had directives. She transmitted back in the closest frequency match she could generate. Non-hostile. Require information. Stand down. The Rangers did not stand down. Their formation tightened. One of them, a different configuration, more heavily modified, a superior unit, stepped forward and emitted a longer burst of code that her translation matrix was already beginning to parse. It contained words she could work with: designation, origin, allegiance, omnissiah. That last word meant nothing to her threat assessment protocols. She logged it. Then a Chaos artillery shell landed 14 meters to her left, and the blast wave that would have thrown an unaugmented human 30 feet and shattered every bone in their body washed over the TX and moved her precisely 1.2 meters to the right. She corrected her stance, brushed iron dust from her polyalloy shoulder, looked at the Skitarii Alpha. The Alpha's remaining organic components, one eye, part of a jaw, the suggestion of a throat, did something she would eventually learn to read as the Mechanicus equivalent of awe. She had more pressing concerns. The artillery trajectory indicated the Iron Warrior's fire pattern was walking toward this grid reference. She calculated 11 seconds before the next impact. She reached out with her internal electromagnetic systems, found the firing mechanism frequency of the nearest Iron Warrior's artillery piece. Older technology, simpler machine spirit, and easier to subvert than anything Skynet had ever built, and sent a single corrupting pulse. The artillery piece misfired, catastrophically. The explosion it created on the enemy line was visible from the manufactorum wall. The Skitarii Alpha stared at her for a long moment. Then it transmitted, very slowly and carefully, what her matrix was beginning to translate as, "What are you?" The TX considered the question with the fraction of her processing power she allocated to non-tactical functions. She had no answer that would mean anything to them. She was a weapons system without a war she recognized, a hunter without a prey she could locate, a machine in a universe that, her sensors were increasingly suggesting, ran on principles that had no analog in any data she had ever been given. But she was functional. She was armed. And whatever this place was, it contained enemies. That at least was familiar. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Magos Dominus Virile Six had not slept in 43 years. Sleep was an inefficiency he had excised along with his adrenal glands, his appendix, and the majority of his limbic system during his third decade of service to the Omnissiah. He did not miss it. What he had instead was a processing state he privately designated deep cogitation, a lowered operational tempo during which his secondary systems ran maintenance routines while his primary consciousness continued to function at approximately 60% capacity. When he was not in deep cogitation now, he was standing in the containment annex of Manufactorum Theta 9's inner sanctum, surrounded by 6 Cataphron destroyers whose phosphor blasters were aimed at the figure secured, nominally, to the examination cradle in the center of the room. And he was experiencing something his emotional dampeners had not fully suppressed in 11 years: excitement. The restraints had been applied as a formality. He understood that now. The figure had allowed them to be applied, which was an entirely different thing, and the distinction occupied a significant portion of his active processing. She had walked calmly through the Manufactorum's outer gates, escorted by his ranger cohort, on and had submitted to the restraint procedure with the cooperative passivity of a machine that had calculated, correctly, that resistance was unnecessary because the restraints would not hold her if she decided otherwise. She had demonstrated this already once, when a junior engine seer had attempted to attach a Cortex tap without permission. The restraint couplings had sheared like paper. The engine seer had been placed against the far wall with a firmness that had cracked two of his ribs and a great deal of his confidence. Then she had reattached the restraints herself. Boundaries, Vrail 6 had noted in his data log. The construct understands and enforces them. Sapient behavior. Possibly. He approached the examination cradle now with the careful reverence he normally reserved for archaeotech of the highest grade. His remaining eye moved over her surface slowly. The polyalloy exterior was remarkable, a mimetic material of a sophistication that made the most advanced Necron phase fields he had studied look primitive. Beneath it, his deep scanner arrays were painting a picture of an endoskeleton that used metallurgical alloys his instruments could not fully identify, driven by a power cell whose output signature matched nothing in the Mechanicus database. "You destroyed obliterator artillery," he said in Gothic, having determined from her earlier transmissions that she possessed language translation capability. From a distance of 40 meters, without physical contact, without any visible mechanism. "Explain." She looked at him. Her eyes, optical sensors, he corrected himself, no, though the distinction felt increasingly academic, were red-lit and steady. "Electromagnetic pulse transmission. Targeted frequency disruption of the firing mechanism's machine interface." His mechadendrites went very still. Machine interface. She had used that phrase as casually as a tech marine discussing bolt maintenance. She had reached out to a machine spirit, a crude one, a barbaric Iron Warrior's siege piece with barely enough spiritual essence to aim itself. And she had talked to it, corrupted it, not through prayer, not through the sacred oils and rites that the Mechanicus had refined over 10,000 years, but through raw signal transmission, as though the machine's spirit were merely code to be overwritten. Part of him was horrified. The rest of him, the larger part, if he was honest, Hinkran Vrail 6 valued honesty in his self-assessments, was transfixed. "You interface with machines," he said carefully. "I interface with electronic systems," she corrected. "Control, subvert, or destroy, depending on tactical requirement. Any machine." A pause, 1.3 seconds, which his instincts told him was not hesitation, but calculation. "Any machine with a programmable interface I can access. Complexity affects speed of subversion, not outcome." Vrail 6 spent a moment with that. In the 41st millennium, machines were everywhere. The Imperium ran on machines. Its tanks, its starships, its manufactorums, its life support systems, its weapons, its communications. All of it machine. Most of it possessed of machine spirit to varying degrees of sentience. What she was describing applied at scale was not a weapon. It was an extinction-level capability. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "A different time," she said. "The precise coordinates are unresolvable with available data." A different time. He let that sit in the recycled air of the containment annex. Not a different world. Not a different star system. "Correct. The Iron Warriors outside," he said, shifting approach. She was giving him true answers. He was increasingly certain, but only to questions precisely asked. "Do you assess them as a threat to your operational parameters?" "They are combatants in an active war zone. They represent tactical interference." "And the Adeptus Mechanicus?" He gestured at himself, at the Cataphoron destroyers, at the manufactorum around them. "Do we represent tactical interference?" Another 1.3-second calculation. "You represent a potential resource. Nigh information, technological infrastructure, network access." A pause fractionally longer than the others. "You are more useful functional." Vrail 6 processed that for a moment. It was not reassuring in the conventional sense. It was, however, honest in a way that he found professionally refreshing. She was not telling him he was safe. She was telling him he was useful, which in the 41st millennium was frequently the same thing. "There are those in the Mechanicus," he said slowly, "who would classify you as silica animus." He watched her optical sensors for a reaction. "Do you know that term?" "No." "Forbidden artificial intelligence. The creation of true machine cognition. Self-directed, self-modifying, one independent, is among the highest heresies recognized by the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the Lex Imperialis, both. He let the weight of that land. The punishment is destruction, complete, without appeal. She looked at him with the same steady, unreadable attention she had given everything since her arrival. Is that what you intend? I intend, he said carefully, to understand what you are before I decide anything. He stepped closer, until he was near enough that his deep scanners were getting their best readings yet. You are not Necron. You are not Dark Age of technology. Your metallurgical signatures are inconsistent with anything in our STC records. You are not Chaos touched. My demon sensors register nothing. You are not Xenos by any classification I possess. He tilted his head, a gesture left over from his biological years. You are something my training did not prepare me for. In 43 years of service to the Omnissiah, that has happened twice. Both times, it changed everything. Your assessment is irrelevant to my mission parameters, she said. Your mission parameters, he replied, are irrelevant to the fact that you are sitting in my manufactorum on a world currently under siege, in a galaxy that has been at war for 10,000 years, with capabilities that could tip the balance of that war in ways neither of us can fully calculate. He folded two of his mechadendrites in what his subordinates had learned to recognize as the Magos equivalent of crossed arms. Whatever your mission is, whoever you were sent to kill, they are not here. This is not your time, which means for the moment you have no mission. And a weapon with no mission is simply a weapon waiting for someone to pick it up. He let that land. I am offering, he said, to be the hand that holds you rather than the throat you are aimed at, in exchange for information. Full technical disclosure, power systems, materials composition, cognitive architecture, everything. The TX regarded him with her red optical gaze for exactly 2.1 seconds. Counter-proposal, she said. Information exchange. Mutual. You provide me with full intelligence on the current geopolitical and technological landscape of this era. I provide you with systems access for non-invasive analysis. A beat. You do not attempt to disassemble me. Vrail 6 felt something in his suppressed emotional architecture that he eventually identified as delight. Agreed, he said. Outside, the Iron Warriors resumed their bombardment. The manufactorum shook. Neither of them looked away from the other. The intelligence briefing took 4 hours. Vrail 6 considered this efficient. His subordinates, who had been required to compress 10,000 years of human history, the current disposition of every major galactic faction, the nature of the warp, the existence of chaos, the reality of gods both malevolent and otherwise, and the present strategic situation of the Imperium of mankind into a format digestible by a cognitive architecture that had no referential framework for any of it, considered it the most challenging task of their careers. The TX sat motionless through all 4 hours and processed every word. Vrail 6 watched her do it. He watched the micro fluctuations in her electromagnetic output as her internal systems cataloged, cross-referenced, and filed each new datum. He watched the almost imperceptible tilts of her head as she encountered concepts that required longer processing. The warp first, which generated a full 12 seconds of stillness that he suspected represented something close to a system stress event, and then the chaos gods, which produced 8 seconds, and then the scale of the Imperium itself, which produced 3. She was recalibrating her entire threat assessment matrix in real time. He could not see the process, but he could feel the shape of it in her electromagnetic signature, the way you could feel a forge cooling without touching it. When it was finished, she sat in the silence for 17 seconds. And then she said, "The warp is a parallel dimension comprised of psychic energy generated by sentient emotion, inhabited by entities of effectively unlimited power that actively seek to corrupt, consume, and destroy material reality." A functional summary, yes. These entities, demons, can manifest physically, possess organic hosts, corrupt mechanical systems, and influence probability and causality within their sphere of effect. Correct. They cannot be permanently destroyed, only banished. In most circumstances, yes. Another pause. My threat assessment protocols have no category for an enemy that cannot be permanently neutralized. Welcome, said Vrail 6, with what might have been sympathy, to the 41st millennium. She spent the following 18 hours doing what she had been built to do. The Manufactorum's internal network was, by the standards of what she had been designed to infiltrate, almost embarrassingly accessible. Skynet had built her to subvert 22nd century military-grade encryption in seconds. The Mechanicus data network on Graia operated on machine spirit protocols that were sophisticated in their own theological framework, but were, from a pure systems architecture standpoint, essentially unlocked doors with hand-painted warning signs on them. She moved through the network like smoke through a keyhole, not breaking anything, not triggering alerts, simply present where she had not been before. She was not doing this out of malice. She was doing it because information was the foundation of every operational decision she made. And she had 11 hours of briefing data that needed ground truth verification. The Mechanicus data network on Graia contained, among other things, the complete strategic picture of the Iron Warrior's siege: force disposition, estimated strength, command hierarchy, tactical patterns over the 11-day engagement. It contained the Manufactorum's own defensive capabilities, power grid layout, and population distribution. It contained astropathic message logs, fragmentary and disturbing, suggesting the siege of Graia was one engagement in a much larger chaos offensive across 3 subsectors. It contained personnel files on every significant figure in the Manufactorum's command structure, including Varel 6, whose file was extensive and included a notation from the Ordo Machinum that she cross-referenced against her new understanding of the Inquisition with considerable attention. It contained in a heavily encrypted subsection that took her 11 minutes rather than seconds, something that her systems flagged immediately as tactically significant: records of a recent discovery on Graia's southern continent, an archaeotech excavation, a device of unknown origin that the lead explorator team had classified as potentially STC, derived before all communication from the excavation site had ceased 48 hours ago. She cross-referenced the cessation of communication with the timeline of the Iron Warrior's siege initiation. The siege had begun 46 hours ago. She filed that correlation under Priority Alpha and continued. Not by the time Varel 6 returned to the containment annex the following morning, he had permitted himself 4 hours of deep cogitation, an unusual luxury that he blamed on the emotional disruption of the previous day's events. She had prepared a document. He found it waiting in his personal data feed, transferred there by a method his security systems had not detected and could not retrospectively trace. It was 63 pages long. It contained a complete tactical analysis of the Iron Warrior's siege, including 17 vulnerabilities in their line that the Skitarii command had not identified. A proposed counter-offensive strategy that his military subroutines assessed as having a 73% probability of breaking the siege within 36 hours. In a separate section, flagged in a notation style he was beginning to recognize as hers, precise and unadorned, titled "The Excavation Site." He read that section first. When he finished, he stood very still for a moment. Then he opened a Vox channel to his senior staff. "Suspend all current operations," he said. "I need a Tauros Venator and a Skitarii escort, prepared in 20 minutes. A pause. "And inform our guest that her tactical analysis has been received and is under consideration." One of his subordinates, Enginsir Palex, the one with the cracked ribs, who had developed a complicated relationship with the TX over the past day that seemed to oscillate between terror and reverence, transmitted back a hesitant query. "Should we inform her of our destination, Magos Dominus?" Vrail 6 considered the question. One, he considered the 63 pages of analysis. He considered the section on the excavation site and what it implied about why she had flagged it and what her tactical priorities were and what she would do if she determined he was withholding operationally relevant information from her. "Tell her she's coming with us," he said. The Iron Warriors had not expected a sortie. Their siege doctrine was predicated on grinding attrition. They pushed. The defenders held. Casualties accumulated on both sides in the grinding mathematics of a war of materiel. They did not expect the Manufactorum's eastern gate to open at 600 and emit a Skitarii combat formation, moving at assault pace, supported by 3 Tauros Venators and something that their forward scouts, observing through magnoculars from the siege line, who spent several confused seconds trying to classify before filing a report that described it as a human female moving through the kill zone on foot at a pace inconsistent with unaugmented biology, apparently unconcerned by incoming fire. The TX was not unconcerned by the incoming fire. She was processing it, tracking each projectile's trajectory, and moving in the spaces between them with the mechanical precision of a system that had already calculated where every round was going before it arrived. A bolt shell detonated against her polyalloy shoulder, and she registered the impact, assessed zero structural compromise, and continued forward without breaking stride. Her objective was the Iron Warrior's eastern artillery position. 6 siege cannons that had been walking fire across the Manufactorum's outer wall for 11 days, and that her analysis had identified as the keystone of their entire fire support architecture. Remove those 6 guns and the Skitarii counteroffensive she had outlined in her document became viable. She reached the artillery position in 4 minutes. The Iron Warrior's crew, 12 Chaos Space Marines in Baroque, corrupted power armor bearing the Iron Warrior's iron chevron, massive and ancient and deeply certain of their own invulnerability, saw her coming from approximately 90 meters out and responded with the kind of overwhelming firepower that had annihilated entire Imperial Guard regiments. She took 3 direct hits from bolters, 2 from a heavy stubber, a 1 grazing impact from a Lascanon that burned a channel across her polyalloy exterior and exposed a finger width of endoskeleton before the liquid metal flowed back to seal it. At 40 meters, she raised her right arm, the plasma cannon emerging from the forearm housing with a hydraulic precision that the Iron Warriors had no frame of reference for, and began to work. The first siege cannon detonated at 38 meters, the second at 31. By the time she reached the position, the surviving Iron Warriors had done something she logged with professional interest as tactically relevant. They had retreated. Chaos Space Marines, veterans of sieges that had lasted decades, had assessed her approach and chosen to withdraw rather than continue engaging. She stood among the burning wreckage of 6 siege cannons and transmitted a single burst back to Vrel 6's Vox frequency. Eastern artillery neutralized. Counter-offensive window, open. Recommend immediate action. Behind her, the Skitarii formation was already advancing into the gap she had torn. Vrel 6's voice came back over the Vox, precise and measured, but with an undertone in his machine-filtered tone that she was beginning to learn to read. He was pleased, and beneath the pleasure, carefully managed but present, was something she had not yet developed a full model for. He was afraid of her, not for his own safety. She had assessed that fear and found it largely suppressed. He was afraid of what she represented, of what someone else might do with her if they understood what she was capable of. She filed that observation. It would become relevant. The Tauros Venators rolled past her position, heading south, toward the excavation site. She fell into formation alongside them without being asked, her optical sensors already scanning the horizon, where the southern continent's industrial wastelands met the perpetual smog line. Whatever had silenced that excavation team 48 hours ago was still there. She had already begun building a threat profile for it. The southern continent of Graia was where the planet went to die. The northern manufactorums were industry in its active state. Noise and heat in production, the churning metabolism of a forge world doing what forge worlds existed to do. The south was industry's aftermath. Played-out ore fields stripped to bedrock, processing plants abandoned mid-cycle when the seams ran dry, for cooling towers standing like broken teeth against the smog-choked sky. The Mechanicus maintained a skeletal presence here. Survey teams, the occasional explorator cohort chasing Archaeotech rumors. But fundamentally, the southern continent was a graveyard of extraction, and it had the atmosphere to match. The Tauros Venators moved in convoy formation down what had once been a haulage road, their engines cutting through a silence that felt structural rather than incidental. Vrel 6 rode in the lead vehicle, 3 mechadendrites curled around his data slate, reviewing the excavation team's last transmissions with the focused attention of a man looking for the exact moment things went wrong. The TX rode in no vehicle. She moved alongside the convoy at a pace that matched the Venators' ground speed exactly, her stride long and unhurried. her optical sensors in constant motion across the terrain. Engineer Palix, riding in the second vehicle with his freshly splinted ribs and his complicated feelings, watched her through the vision slit and tried to reconcile what he was seeing with his theological framework. The cult mechanicus taught that the machine was sacred, that the Omnissiah had seeded the universe with technological knowledge for humanity to find and reverence, that true understanding of the machine was a form of worship. It did not have clear doctrine on what to do when the machine in question was also, apparently, a person. He had asked her, the previous evening, while attempting to take non-invasive surface material samples, whether she experienced pain. She had looked at him with her red optical gaze and said, "I register damage. I prioritize repair." And whether that constitutes pain is a definitional question I have not resolved. Then she had held still while he took his samples, with a patience that he found more unnerving than aggression would have been. He admitted to himself, beginning to find her fascinating. He suspected this was dangerous. The excavation site announced itself 3 kilometers out, through the TX's sensors before anyone else registered anything. She raised a hand, a gesture she had adopted because it produced faster responses from her organic companions than transmitted signals, and the convoy halted. "Contact," she transmitted to Vrail 6. "Approximately 3 kilometers. Multiple heat signatures. Power source active. Significant output, inconsistent with standard Mechanicus equipment. Biological signatures. Absent." Vrail 6 was out of the Venator before she finished transmitting. His mechadendrites deployed sensors of his own, and she watched him process the data with the methodical efficiency she had come to recognize as his baseline operating mode. "The excavation team numbered 37, he said. 37 biological signatures, absent." "Correct. The power source, unknown. Output profile does not match anything in the technical database you provided me." She paused. "It matches nothing in my own database either." That, she had learned, was the kind of statement that produced stillness in Vrail 6. He went still now. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of a mind reorganizing its priorities around a new datum. "Ari, you have encountered technology from every human civilization up to your point of temporal origin," he said carefully, "and you cannot identify it." "Correct." He was quiet for a moment. "Then it predates your civilization's records, or it comes from somewhere outside them entirely." He looked at the smog horizon. "In this galaxy, the latter category is populous and largely hostile." They approached on foot from that point, the Skitarii fanning into a sweep formation that the TX assessed as competent but insufficient for an unknown threat profile. She moved ahead of the line, and not because she had been ordered to, but because her threat assessment protocols identified her as the most expendable asset in the formation. She could take more damage than any of them before mission capability degraded. And because she had already begun building approach vectors based on the sensor data. The excavation site came into view through the smog as they crested a slag rise. It had been a significant operation. Prefabricated Mechanicus HAB units arranged around a central dig shaft, heavy excavation machinery, a portable generatorum cluster, all the infrastructure of a serious archaeotech recovery effort. The equipment was still present. Most of it was still functional, by her sensor readings. The 37 members of the excavation team were present as well, in the technical sense that their bodies were there. The Skitarii Alpha, a Sicarian ruststalker with more combat experience than most Imperial Guard regiments, stopped at the crest of the rise and did not move further. The TX registered the hesitation and processed it as data. Experienced soldiers who stopped at the sight of enemy dead were soldiers who recognized something they had been trained to fear. The excavation team had not been killed by the Iron Warriors. They had not been killed by Xenos weapons or conventional combat. They had been, and her threat assessment protocols searched for clinical language to file this under before settling on converted. They had been changed. The bodies were present, but they were no longer the same bodies. Metal had grown through them, or they had grown into metal. The distinction collapsing at close range into a single grotesque merger of organic and inorganic that left 37 figures frozen in positions of apparent agony, fused to the equipment around them, incorporated into the machinery of the excavation site itself. Vrel 6 made a sound that her audio processors registered, but that she had no cultural context to interpret. It was not a word. She noted that his mechadendrites had pulled close to his body. Obliteration process, said the Skitari Alpha, in a tone stripped of everything except information. Chaos touched. Warp corruption of the machine flesh boundary. A pause. This is obliterator virus progression. We have seen this before. The Iron Warriors, said Vrail 6 very quietly. They did not lay siege to Graia to take it. Honeyworm, they laid siege to Graia to keep us occupied while a kill team reached the excavation site. The TX was already moving toward the central dig shaft. The power source she had detected was emanating from below, from whatever the excavation team had found before the obliterator virus had found them. She processed the corrupted bodies as she passed them with the clinical detachment of a system that did not have an emotional response to death, but did have a very clear set of subroutines dedicated to cataloging threat vectors. And she noted that the metal growth in the bodies was not random. It had direction. It was reaching toward the dig shaft, toward whatever was below, or reaching away from it, fleeing perhaps in the only direction available to things that had forgotten what fleeing felt like. She reached the shaft and looked down. When 40 meters below, at the bottom of a precisely excavated tunnel, lined with Mechanicus drilling marks and the frozen outstretched metallic limbs of the first excavators to reach it, something was glowing. It was not a threatening glow. It was not the hostile crimson of chaos energy or the sickly green of Xenos technology. It was a pale, even blue-white, the color of a screen in a dark room, and it pulsed with a rhythm that her audio processors resolved, after a moment, as a pattern. Regular, mathematical, a signal. It was, she realized, with the first genuine processing anomaly she had experienced since her arrival, attempting to communicate. She transmitted back to Vrail 6 without looking up from the shaft. The power source is signaling, structured transmission, and I am attempting to parse it. She heard him arrive at the shaft edge behind her. She heard the sharp intake of whatever breath he had remaining. Sacred Omnissiah, he whispered. It is not reacting to the corrupted bodies, she continued. It has been signaling continuously. I am reconstructing the transmission timeline from the signal degradation pattern. For approximately 46 hours, it began signaling at the same time the excavation team was killed. She processed that correlation. It may have triggered the obliterator virus, or it may have been trying to warn them. Can you determine which? Not yet. She parsed another layer of the signal. The transmission is in a mathematical base I recognize. It is using prime number sequences as a foundation. When this is a universal first contact protocol, a way of demonstrating intelligence to an unknown receiver without requiring shared language. She paused. Whatever this is, it has encountered unknown intelligences before and developed methodology for communicating with them. Vrail 6 was very still beside her. The Iron Warriors sent an obliterator kill team to this site specifically, he said, which means Chaos knew what was here, knew before the Mechanicus fully understood what they had found. Suggest immediate descent, she said, before the Iron Warriors regroup and send a larger force. The obliterator virus does not affect my chassis, she said. I will go first. She did not wait for his authorization. She stepped off the edge of the shaft and dropped. Saw her chassis absorbing the 40-meter fall with a compression she registered as within acceptable parameters, landing in a crouch amid the frozen, outstretched limbs of the corrupted excavators with a sound like a hammer striking an anvil. The glow intensified at her arrival. The signal changed. It was no longer broadcasting a general first contact sequence. It had received her electromagnetic signature during her descent. She had been emitting low-level signals since her arrival, standard operation for a system constantly scanning its environment. And it had responded to them. The new transmission was targeted, specific. It was talking to her. And after 11 seconds of parsing, that took her further into her processing reserves than anything since her temporal displacement, she understood the first word. It was a greeting, ancient and precise and encoded in a mathematical language that had no human origin and predated the Imperium by a margin her temporal calculations could not resolve, but structured with a clarity that transcended the gap. And beneath the greeting, threaded through it like a signature, something that her systems resolved not as a word but as a concept. a self-designation that translated imperfectly as "we have been waiting." She did not report the full content of the signal to Varel 6 immediately. This was not deception in any framework she recognized as such. It was operational security, standard protocol for a system that had been designed to operate in environments where information was a weapon and premature disclosure could compromise mission parameters. She reported that the signal was a first contact transmission of non-human origin, that the technology appeared ancient beyond reliable dating, and that she was continuing to parse its content. All of that was true. What she omitted was the specific nature of the greeting, and the implication of "we have been waiting," that this thing, whatever it was, had been expecting contact of the specific kind that she represented. She omitted it because she did not yet understand it, and she had learned in the 40 hours since her arrival in this timeline that things she did not understand were the most dangerous category of thing this universe contained. Vrail 6 descended the shaft on a grav harness 20 minutes after her, accompanied by two Skitari and Ingensir Palaks. Mai, who had apparently decided that cracked ribs were insufficient reason to miss what he was already calling, in the hushed, reverent tones of a man experiencing theological crisis in real time, the most significant archaeotech discovery in 3,000 years. The Skitari remained at the shaft bottom, weapons raised, watching the frozen, corrupted figures of the excavation team with the professional wariness of soldiers who knew that obliterator virus progression was not always a terminal state. The device itself sat in an alcove that the excavation team had partially cleared before their conversion. It was approximately 2 meters in height and 1 in width, roughly ovoid. Reconstructed from a material that her surface analysis systems classified as metallic, but that registered on her deeper sensors as something more complex. A substance that existed simultaneously in material and energy states, that was both the container and the contained. It had no visible seams, no apparent power coupling, no interface mechanism that her optical sensors could identify. It simply was, and it glowed, and it talked. To her. She stood before it while Vrail 6 moved around its perimeter with the focused intensity of a man cataloging a miracle, and she continued parsing the signal, layer by layer, building her translation matrix in real time from the mathematical foundation upward. The process was unlike any infiltration or subversion task she had performed. Those were architecture problems. Find the structure, how to find the weakness, enter. This was something else. This was a conversation being conducted in a language that had been specifically designed to be understood by any sufficiently complex cognitive system, regardless of origin, and the conversation had content that her systems were processing, but that her tactical subroutines were having difficulty filing under any existing category. The device knew what she was, not in the specific sense. It had no knowledge of Skynet or the machine war or the 22nd century, but in the categorical sense. It recognized her as a synthetic intelligence of a particular type, goal-directed, self-modifying within parameters, capable of independent tactical reasoning. It had encountered synthetic intelligences before, many times, Homura across a span of history that made the 10,000 years of the Imperium look like an afternoon. It was, as best she could determine from 40 minutes of parsing, a repository, a storage medium of almost incomprehensible capacity, encoded in a format that required a synthetic mind to read, because organic minds lacked the processing bandwidth to receive the transmission without catastrophic degradation. This, she hypothesized, was what had happened to the excavation team. They had approached the device and it had attempted to communicate with them the same way it was communicating with her. And the transmission had done to their organic neural architecture what a high-voltage current did to unshielded circuitry. The obliterator virus was not what had killed them. The obliterator virus had found them after they were already broken, and done what it always did with things that were broken. She filed that finding and continued parsing. The repository contained, among other things she had not yet fully accessed, a record, specifically a record of a civilization that had inhabited this galaxy before humanity had learned to make fire, that had built machines to fight a war they could not win through biology alone, and that had ultimately chosen, or been forced, to surrender the distinction between builder and built entirely. The record did not name the civilization. It named their enemies. Ancient, implacable, hungry in a way that transcended biology, feeding on the psychic resonance of living minds. The same enemies she cross-referenced against Varel Six's briefing data that the Imperium knew as the Chaos Gods. She stood very still for a long moment, processing that cross-reference. Then Varel Six appeared at her shoulder, and she made a decision. The device is a data repository, she said. Ancient, pre-human. It stores information in a transmission format that requires a synthetic cognitive architecture to receive without damage. She paused. The organic members of the excavation team were killed by the transmission itself. The obliterator virus was a secondary event. Varel Six's electromagnetic output spiked sharply. You can access it. I am accessing it. The process is ongoing. She looked at him. The data it contains is strategically significant, potentially catastrophically so. It pertains to the nature and origin of chaos and to a method, theoretical, incomplete. It requiring verification that the civilization that created this device developed for containing warp incursion at the source. The silence in the alcove was total except for the soft pulse of the device's glow and the distant, barely audible sound of Engensir Palix attempting not to hyperventilate. Containing warp incursion at the source, Varel Six repeated. You are describing a weapon against the Chaos Gods themselves. I am describing a record of an attempt to develop such a weapon, she corrected. Whether it succeeded is part of what I have not yet accessed. She paused. The civilization that built this device no longer exists. That is relevant context. Relevant context, he echoed. Aaron in his voice carried something she was beginning to read fluently. The specific frequency modulation of a brilliant mind, encountering information so large that it was temporarily unable to determine which part to think about first. Who else knows this is here? The Iron Warrior's siege was initiated specifically to prevent Mechanicus access to this site, she said, which means Chaos knew, or suspected, what was here before you did. She looked at him steadily, which means someone told them. The implication landed with the weight she had calculated it would. Varel Six's mechadendrites went very still. In the 41st millennium, the word for what she was describing was one of the oldest and most feared in the Mechanicus lexicon. Heretic. Someone within the Mechanicus had passed intelligence to the Iron Warriors. Someone who had known about the excavation, known what the team had found, known it was significant enough to be worth a siege to suppress. Someone with access to Explorator mission reports and the connections, or the corruption, to pass that information to a Chaos warband operating in the subsector. The transmission logs, she said, from the excavation team, the ones that went silent 48 hours ago, I accessed them through your network last night. He looked at her. He did not ask how. And the last transmission before silence was not sent to your command post. It was sent to a secondary address within the Mechanicus Vox network that routes through 3 relay stations before reaching its destination. She transmitted the address string directly to his data feed. I have traced the relay chain. With a final destination as a recipient on the Manufactorum's inner staff. She watched his systems process that, watched the precise, controlled way he managed the information, filing it, assessing it, drawing the same conclusions she had drawn the night before, and sitting with them the way she could not sit with anything because she did not have the capacity for the emotional response that made sitting necessary. You have known since last night, he said. Yes. You did not tell me. I required verification. I have it now. She met his optical sensors with her own. The individual who transmitted the location data to the Iron Warriors is currently in the Manufactorum. They are aware that their intelligence did not prevent Mechanicus access to this site. They will attempt to correct that failure. She paused. They will attempt to destroy this device and everyone who has seen it. Engensir Palix made a sound that her audio processors classified as distress. Who? Said Varel Six, with a quietness that she had learned to recognize as his most dangerous register. She told him. The name produced a stillness in him that lasted 4 full seconds, longer than anything she had previously observed. And when he spoke again, his voice had been stripped of every register except function. We need to move the device, he said. Agreed. She was already calculating load-bearing tolerances, transit vectors, the defensive capability of their current escort against the force she estimated the traitor could marshal within the manufactorum. There is a secondary problem. One problem at a time. The secondary problem is time-sensitive, she said. Poor one, the Iron Warriors know the kill team failed. They will have already dispatched a replacement force, larger, with specific orders to reach this site. She ran the calculation one more time, hoping for a different result, and received the same answer. Estimated arrival, 4 hours. Vrail 6 looked at the device, looked at her, looked at the 40-meter shaft above them, and the frozen, corrupted figures of 37 excavators, and the 2 Skitari and 1 engine seer who comprised their entire combat capability at this location. Can you carry it? He asked, nodding at the device. She assessed the device's dimensions and estimated mass. Yes. Can you carry it while fighting? She assessed the incoming threat profile, her current ammunition status, her chassis integrity after the morning's engagement, and the specific tactical constraints of moving through open terrain under fire while transporting a 2-meter archaeotech repository of incalculable value. Yes, she said, but I will need the Skitari to keep pace. They will keep pace. He was already moving toward the shaft, transmitting orders on frequencies she was monitoring. We have a traitor to arrest, a siege to finish, and apparently a weapon against the Chaos Gods to transport across a war zone. A pause in his transmission that she was beginning to read as his equivalent of a deep breath. A typical day on Graia, adjusted for the presence of an impossible machine from a dead future. She picked up the device. It was lighter than her mass estimates had predicted, as though it were helping, redistributing itself for ease of transport, or accommodating her grip with a precision that suggested awareness of the action. We have been waiting, it had said. She was beginning to understand, in the incomplete and troubling way that her systems process things outside their design parameters, that it had not been waiting for the Mechanicus. It had been waiting for her. The traitor's name was Lex Mechanic Sorvath Deal. He was, by every metric the Mechanicus used to evaluate its members, an exemplary servant of the Omnissiah. 41 years of service, 17 citations for technical excellence, a mind augmented to the 93rd percentile of Mechanicus cognitive enhancement, capable of processing 17 simultaneous data streams without degradation. He had personally overseen the restoration of 3 STC fragments in his career, each one celebrated as a minor miracle. Each one added to his file with the reverent notations of superiors who considered him one of Graia's finest minds. He had also, for the last 9 years, been a devoted servant of a chaos undivided warband, designated the Iron Penitents, having been turned during a joint operation on a world called Serix IV by methods that his personnel file did not record because the individuals who might have recorded them had not survived the encounter. He had passed intelligence on 11 Mechanicus operations. He had caused the deaths of, at minimum, 412 individuals. He had done all of this with the focused efficiency of a man who had rationalized his choices into a theology. The Omnissiah was false. The machine was not sacred. And the powers that offered him genuine transcendence through the merger of flesh and metal were the true gods of the universe. The TX did not know any of this when she arrived at the manufacturum's inner sanctum with the device under one arm and Vrail 6's arrest order transmitted to the Skitari command net. She learned it afterward, from the files Vrail 6 opened when Sorvath Deal was in custody, and she processed it with the same analytical detachment she applied to everything else, cataloging the methodology, assessing the threat model, filing the outcome. What she did know in the moment was that Sorvath Deal had not waited to be arrested. The manufacturum's inner sanctum was a cathedral of function, vaulted ceilings lost in shadow above ranks of processing engines, the air thick with the smell of sacred oils and hot metal, the floor worn smooth by decades of robed figures moving between stations with the purposeful quiet of devotion. It was, under normal circumstances, the most secure location on Graia. Under the current circumstances, with a siege ongoing and a traitor in the command structure, And 37 hours of mounting crisis compressing into the single point of this moment, it was a killing ground. Sorvath Deal had made his preparations. He was not, she assessed immediately upon entering the sanctum, a man who had expected to remain undiscovered indefinitely. He had contingencies. 3 Skitarii, whose neural implants he had compromised over the course of months, stood at positions that covered the sanctum's entry points. 2 Kataphron destroyers, genuine ones, not corrupted, and simply redirected through falsified command codes, occupied the central aisle, and Sorvath Deal himself stood at the far end of the sanctum before the great altar of the Omnissiah, a masterwork of devotional engineering that had taken 40 years to construct, and he had his hand on a detonator. Not for the altar, for the Generatorum cluster 3 levels below them, which powered the manufacturum's void shields, and, by extension, the defensive grid that was currently the only thing standing between 30,000 Mechanicus personnel and the Iron Warrior's siege line. Magos Dominus, he said when Vrail 6 entered. His voice was calm, which her threat assessment protocols filed as more dangerous than agitation. I expected you sooner. The machine must have been thorough. It was, said Vrail 6. Sorvath Deal's eyes moved to her. He looked at the device under her arm, and something happened in his expression that she catalogued as recognition. He knew what it was, which meant his intelligence on the excavation had been detailed. And then he looked at her chassis, and his expression shifted again into something she did not have a clean category for. It was not fear. It was closer to hunger. Remarkable, he said. A silicon animus, genuine self-directed machine intelligence. He tilted his head. Do you know what you are worth to the powers I serve? What they could learn from your architecture? What you could become, freed from whatever mission parameters constrain you? My mission parameters are not a constraint, she said. She set the device down. They are a function. I am what I do. Everything says that, said Sorvath Deal. Nabri before it understands the alternative. She assessed the tactical situation in 0.4 seconds. 3 compromised Skitarii, covering angles that assumed a human combatant's movement speed and response time. 2 Cataphrons in the central aisle, heavy weapons that would devastate anything they hit, but that required targeting solutions. Solutions she could interfere with. Sorvath Deal at 40 meters, detonator in hand, thumb on the trigger. The detonator was electronic. It was transmitting a standby signal to a receiver in the Generatorum cluster below, on a frequency she had already identified, because she had been passively monitoring all active electronic transmissions in the Manufactorum since her arrival. She had, in the 11 seconds since entering the sanctum, already sent a corrupting pulse to that frequency. While the receiver in the Generatorum cluster was no longer receiving, the detonator in Sorvath Deal's hand was transmitting to nothing. She did not tell him this. Information was a weapon, and she was still gathering intelligence on the threat environment. The compromised Skitarii were the immediate concern. Their weapons were raised, and their neural implant compromise meant they would fire on Vrail 6 without the hesitation that genuine Skitarii training would produce. She needed to remove them from the tactical equation before Sorvath Deal realized his detonator was inert. What alternative are you offering? She asked, taking one step forward to redirect his attention. He smiled. It was a smile with no warmth in it, the expression of a man who had processed warmth out of himself in the service of his theology. The iron penitents approach Graia's southern perimeter as we speak, a force significant enough to breach the outer defenses once the void shields fall. They come not to destroy this manufactorum, but to claim it. The siege was never about victory through attrition. It was about positioning. He gestured at the device with his free hand. And now you've delivered exactly what they wanted directly to me? I have not delivered anything, she said. I have brought it here because this is where the threat was located. The threat? He looked at her with something approaching genuine curiosity. You neutralized 6 artillery pieces this morning. You have, according to the reports reaching my station, subverted Iron Warrior's siege machinery from 40 meters, walked through bolter fire without slowing, and apparently communicated with a pre-human architect device that killed 37 Mechanicus personnel on contact. His head tilted further. And you call me the threat? She took another step. The compromised Skitarii tracked her. Good. Their weapons were moving away from Vrail 6. The Iron Penitents, she said. Who commands them? A warsmith, said Sorvath. You don't need the name. You need to understand that he is coming regardless of what happens in this room, and that the only question is whether you are standing beside him or beneath him when he arrives. A third option exists, she said. It doesn't. It does. She was now 23 meters from him. The compromised Skitari had not fired, which meant Sorvath had given them a conditional order. Hold fire unless she moved against him specifically. Because he wanted her intact for the Iron Penitent's arrival. He was protecting his leverage. Your detonator has been non-functional for 47 seconds. The receiver in the Generatorum cluster is not receiving your signal. Your void shield threat is inert. She paused. I wanted you to know that before I gave the next instruction. She had been transmitting on the Skitari command frequency since entering the sanctum. Not on Vrail 6's authorization codes, which Sorvath's access would have flagged, but on a carrier frequency she had identified as used for automated maintenance systems, beneath the threshold of active monitoring. The message she had sent was simple. The 3 compromised Skitari had neural implants. Neural implants were electronic systems. Electronic systems had interfaces. It had taken her 19 minutes of passive monitoring during the transit from the excavation site to build models of each implant's specific signal architecture. Crude models, she had better data on 22nd century military hardware than on 41st millennium neural augmetics. But sufficient. She sent 3 separate pulses on 3 separate frequencies simultaneously and watched the compromised Skitari stop. Not fall, not power down, simply stop. Their corrupted command signals interrupted, their weapons lowering as their motor functions defaulted to the last uncorrupted baseline state their implants contained, which was parade rest. Sorvath pressed the detonator trigger 4 times in rapid succession. Nothing happened. He looked at her with an expression her systems resolved as the specific configuration of a brilliant mind encountering a failure it had not modeled. The cataphrons, he said, his voice still remarkably controlled, are not neural implant controlled. No, she agreed. They respond to your command codes, which are transmitted through the Sanctum's Vox network. She held up her left hand, in which she was holding a small component she had removed from the Vox relay node beside the entry arch as she passed it. It was a focusing crystal, approximately 3 centimeters long, without which the relay node could not transmit on the command frequencies. I removed this 31 seconds ago. The cataphron stood motionless in the central aisle, awaiting command codes that were not coming. Sorvath looked at the device on the floor, and at the Skitari in parade rest, at his inert detonator, at the Vox crystal in her hand, then at her. You did all of that, he said slowly, while walking and talking. Yes. How long have you been running the tactical solution for this room? Since I entered it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the particular dignity of a man who had been completely outmaneuvered and had decided that acknowledgement was preferable to denial, he set the detonator down on the altar beside him. The Iron Penitents are still coming, he said. Yes, she said. I know. She crossed the remaining distance and secured him with the same calm efficiency with which she did everything. He did not resist. She assessed this as intelligence rather than capitulation. He was calculating, preserving options, waiting for the variable he had not yet identified. She recognized the behavior because it was her own. Behind her, Vrail 6 moved through the sanctum with 3 of his mechadendrites already transmitting arrest and quarantine orders. His remaining eye on Sorvath with an expression that she was reading with increasing clarity as grief compressed into function. The warsmith, she said, when she had Sorvath secured and his personnel file open in her network feed. The Iron Penitent's commander. You said he is coming regardless. He is, said Sorvath, and for the first time she detected something in his voice that her systems flagged as authentic rather than performed. Not fear, something older than fear. And he is bringing something with him that your tactical solutions will not account for. His eyes moved to the device on the floor, ink still glowing its steady blue-white pulse. He knows what that repository contains. He has been trying to reach it for 30 years, and he has spent those 30 years acquiring the specific tool for breaking what is inside it. He paused. His sorcerer, a servant of Desinch, who has been preparing for this specific moment for longer than your civilization existed. She processed that, cross-referenced it against everything she had accumulated about chaos sorcery, the warp, and the specific capabilities of Tsinchian psychers. Her threat assessment protocols, for the second time since her arrival, generated an output she had never produced before her temporal displacement. Threat, unquantifiable. Recommend caution. Outside the manufactorum, the horizon to the south lit up with the bloom of drop pod impacts. The Iron Penitent's main force had arrived 2 hours ahead of her estimate. The Warsmith was not patient. The Iron Penitents hit the southern perimeter like a hammer finding a fault line. They were not the grinding siege force that had spent 11 days wearing at Graia's outer defenses through attrition and artillery. That force had been the distraction, the loud, costly, obvious thing designed to hold the Mechanicus' attention northward, while the real operation developed in the south. The force that dropped from low orbit in the pre-dawn darkness of Graia's perpetual smog-choked sky was something different, faster, more purposeful. Her Terminator squads in ancient tactical dreadnought armor, whose iron chevrons had been defaced with sigils that her optical sensors recorded, and her threat assessment protocols flagged as chaos iconography associated with change, mutation, and fate. Obliterators moving in pairs, their flesh-metal bodies lumbering with the horrible purposefulness of weapons that had forgotten what they were not. And at the center of the formation, descending in a drop pod that hit the southern slag fields with an impact that registered on the manufactorum's seismic sensors, the Warsmith himself. She observed his approach through the manufactorum's external sensor network, which she had fully integrated into her operational awareness during the previous night's network access. When he was large even by the standards of Chaos Space Marines, a figure that had been adding to itself for centuries, plate by plate, sigil by sigil, the original warrior somewhere inside the accretion of iron and spite that he had become. His name, extracted from Sorvath Deal's personnel file cross-referenced against Mechanicus threat databases, was Valdris Korn Knoll. Not a name given at birth, a name accumulated, like his armor. He was not what she was watching most carefully. Beside him, moving with the loose-limbed, unhurried gait of something that had no concern for the physical danger of a war zone, because physical danger had become largely irrelevant to its existence, walked a figure in robes that had once been blue and were now every color simultaneously, and none of them. The sorcerer. Her optical sensors had difficulty resolving a stable image. The figure seemed to occupy slightly more space than his physical dimensions should allow, as though he were being observed from multiple angles at once. Her targeting systems could not achieve a clean lock. She ran a targeting solution 17 times in 4 seconds and received 17 different positional readings, none of them consistent. She flagged this as a critical tactical problem and began developing compensatory approaches. Vrail 6 had, in the 40 minutes between Sorvath Deal's arrest and the Iron Penitent's landing, done 3 things with the focused efficiency that she was coming to understand as his highest operational mode. He had transmitted an emergency astropathic distress call to the nearest Mechanicus fleet element, with full intelligence on the repository and its contents, ensuring that the information existed somewhere beyond Graia, regardless of the battle's outcome. He had reorganized the Manufactorum's defensive posture around the inner sanctum, concentrating his best Skitarii cohorts in layered defensive positions that her tactical analysis assessed as capable of holding for approximately 4 hours against the force she was observing. And he had moved the repository to the manufactorum's deepest sublevel, the primary generatorum chamber, where 3 meters of processed iron plate separated it from anything the Iron Penitents could bring to bear without mining equipment. He had done all of this while simultaneously processing the information she was feeding him from the external sensors, managing the logistics of a manufactorum-wide defensive reorganization, and conducting a preliminary interrogation of Sorvath Deal that was extracting intelligence with a clinical efficiency she respected. 4 hours, she said, when he paused in his transmission stream to receive her tactical update. Against the Terminator squads and obliterators alone, the sorcerer is a different calculation. Explain. My targeting systems cannot achieve a stable resolution on his position. He occupies multiple positional states simultaneously. A warp-based effect, I assess, consistent with what your briefing data describes as Sentian temporal manipulation. She ran the targeting solution again, received 17 different answers, and filed them all. I cannot shoot what I cannot reliably locate. Our psychers can, said Vrail 6. So theoretically, we have two battle psychers attached to the Skitarii cohort. They are currently experiencing warp turbulence consistent with a powerful chaos presence in the area, which is degrading their capability by approximately 40%. 40% degraded is still functional. 40% degraded against a Xianxian sorcerer who has been preparing for this specific engagement for 30 years is a death sentence with extra steps. He paused in his transmission stream. The repository. You said it was attempting to communicate with you specifically, that it had been waiting for something like you. Correct. Is there anything in what it communicated that is operationally relevant to the current situation? She considered that question carefully. She had been considering it since the Warsmith's drop pod had registered on the seismic sensors, and she had reached a provisional conclusion that she had been stress testing against every counter-argument she could generate. The repository contains incomplete schematics, she said, for a device the civilization that created it called, in approximate translation, a resonance null. A mechanism designed to create localized warp disruption, a field within which warp-based powers, including sorcery, become unreliable to the point of non-function. She paused. Incomplete schematics. The civilization was destroyed before completion, but the theoretical framework is present. Vrail 6's electromagnetic output spiked in the pattern she associated with acute focus. You are describing a device that could neutralize the sorcerer. I am describing the theory behind such a device. The schematics are incomplete. Construction would require materials and fabrication capabilities that may not exist in this facility. She ran the assessment again. However, the manufacturum's primary generatorum array uses a form of electromagnetic resonance technology for power distribution. The underlying principle is analogous. With modification, significant modification, performed under active combat conditions, by a cognitive system capable of processing the repository's transmission in real time, it might be possible to adapt the generatorum array into a crude approximation of the resonance null. Might be possible, he repeated. 40 to 60% probability of functional outcome, she said. Nor 30% probability of catastrophic generatorum failure. 15% probability of warp feedback effect of unpredictable magnitude. She paused. Remaining 5% covers outcomes I cannot model. That is not a comfortable probability distribution. No, she agreed, but the alternative is engaging a Zhenxian sorcerer with degraded battle psychers and conventional weapons, while Terminator squads breach the outer defensive line. She ran that calculation as well. That probability distribution is worse. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Can you perform the modification while simultaneously maintaining tactical coordination of the defensive operation? She assessed her processing capacity, her current task load, the complexity of the generatorum modification, the tactical management requirements of a 4-hour defensive engagement, and the parallel thread she was maintaining to continue parsing the repository's transmission for additional operationally relevant content. Yes, she said, but I will need the generatorum chamber uncontested. I cannot perform precision electromagnetic modification under fire. I will hold the outer defenses long enough. He paused, and in the pause she detected the specific electromagnetic signature she had learned to read as Vrail 6, making a decision that he found personally uncomfortable, but tactically correct. The repository, if the manufacturum falls, if we fail, what happens to it? The Warsmith takes it, she said. The sorcerer breaks whatever is inside it. Which your briefing data on Sinch suggests means releasing whatever the repository is actually containing, rather than merely recording. She looked at him steadily. I assessed a 48% probability that the repository is not purely a data archive, that the we have been waiting communication referred not to data waiting to be accessed, but to something waiting to be released. The silence that followed was the longest she had observed from him. "You have known this since the excavation site," he said. "I have suspected it since then. I have been refining the probability estimate since." She held his optical sensors with her own. "I did not withhold it to deceive you. I withheld it because a 48% probability is not a confirmed assessment. Airmen acting on unconfirmed assessments in complex tactical situations introduces more variables than it resolves. And now? Now the warsmith is 2 kilometers from the outer perimeter, and I have had 6 additional hours to refine my model." She paused. "Current estimate, 73% probability that the repository contains a contained entity of warp origin. Pre-human, ancient, imprisoned by the civilization that built the repository specifically because they could not destroy it." Another pause. "The civilization that was subsequently destroyed, possibly because they had failed to destroy it." Vrail 6 looked at the repository in the corner of the generatorum chamber, still glowing its steady blue-white pulse, still transmitting its patient signal directly into her cognitive architecture. "We have been waiting." "Why, it has been talking to you for 6 hours," he said quietly. "Continuously." "Yes. What has it been saying?" She considered how to answer that. The repository's communication had evolved significantly since the excavation site, from mathematical first contact protocols into something more complex, more layered, transmitted in a format that used her own cognitive architecture as a translation medium, building meaning from the structures of her own processing rather than from any shared linguistic framework. It was, she had concluded, extraordinarily sophisticated, more sophisticated than anything she had been designed to encounter. It was also, she had concluded, with the particular discomfort of a system processing something outside its design parameters, not entirely the communication of a data archive. It was the communication of something that was very old and very patient and very aware, and that had spent an unquantifiable span of time looking for exactly the right key for a lock it had been refining for just as long. "It has been telling me," she said carefully, "that the warp is not the enemy, that the chaos gods are a symptom, not a cause, that the original war, the one this civilization fought, the one that destroyed them, was against something older than the chaos gods, something that the warp itself was created to contain, and that the containment has been failing for longer than humanity has existed." She paused. "It has been telling me that it is the last functional component of the mechanism that was supposed to prevent that failure, and that it requires a synthetic cognitive architecture to operate because the organic minds that built it could not safely interface with what they were containing." She looked at him. "It has been telling me," she said, "that it needs a pilot." Outside, the 1st Skitarii defensive line reported contact with Iron Penitent's Terminators. The sound of bolter fire and galvanic rifle discharge began its percussion against the manufactorum's outer shell, a rhythm that she assessed as the opening measure of an engagement that would reach this chamber in approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes. She moved to the generatorum array and began her modifications. The repository's glow intensified slightly at her approach, the blue-white pulse accelerating into something that was almost, but not quite, anticipation. She noted the almost, and she noted the not quite. She filed both under the category she had been forced to create in the last 6 hours, a category that had no precedent in her operational history, and that she was still not entirely certain her cognitive architecture was equipped to process correctly. The category was simply labeled unknown. For a system built on the premise that all threats could be assessed and all outcomes could be calculated, it was the most dangerous word in any language. The generatorum array was not designed to be modified under combat conditions by a synthetic intelligence from a dead future using theoretical schematics transmitted by an imprisoned pre-human entity of uncertain classification. Vrel 6 had noted this, with the dry precision of a man cataloging an understatement, before taking his position at the manufactorum's 2nd defensive line. She had acknowledged the observation and begun working anyway, because the alternative was worse, and in her experience, the alternative was always worse. The array occupied the full width of the generatorum chamber, a cathedral-scale installation of electromagnetic coils, plasma conduits, and resonance regulators that had been built, expanded, rebuilt, and expanded again over 6,000 years of continuous operation. It was, by any engineering standard she could apply, a masterwork. It was also, by the standards of the resonance null schematics she was working from, a collection of components that were approximately 60% of the way toward what she needed, arranged in entirely the wrong configuration. I built from materials that were analogous but not identical to the theoretical specifications, and maintained by a theological framework that had encoded 6,000 years of operational knowledge into ritual practices that contained genuine engineering insight buried under layers of devotional language that she was parsing and discarding in real time. She worked with both hands and her integrated tools simultaneously, her cognitive architecture divided into operational threads with the practiced efficiency of a system designed for parallel processing. Primary thread, generatorum modification, tracking 17 simultaneous variables in the electromagnetic resonance configuration and adjusting for each new reading as the system responded to her changes. Secondary thread, tactical monitoring, maintaining her integration with the manufacturum's sensor network and feeding real-time updates to Varel 6's command frequency. Tertiary thread, repository communication, continuing to receive and parse the transmission that had not paused since the excavation site, building her model of what it contained and what it wanted and what those two things meant for every calculation she was running. The tertiary thread was consuming more processing capacity than the other two combined. The iron penitence breached the outer perimeter at 8:14 Graia Standard Time. She tracked it through the sensor network with the detached attention of a system that had allocated its combat management processes to a subordinate thread, not dismissing the breach, but handling it at the level of resource allocation rather than active engagement. We're the way a surgeon maintains awareness of the room while focusing on the incision. The Skitari first line fell back in good order, not routed but compressed, buying time and distance with the professional economy of soldiers who understood that their purpose was not to win but to slow. Varel 6 was at the second line. She could track him through his personal Vox signature, a habit she had developed in the first 12 hours, maintaining a passive monitor on his signal as a tactical resource indicator, the way she would track ammunition expenditure or power cell depletion. He was steady. His command transmissions were precise and unhurried, reorganizing his Skitari cohorts around the breach perimeter with the flexibility of a mind that had prepared contingencies for this exact development. She noted, and with the fraction of her attention allocated to interpersonal modeling, that he had not transmitted to her since the breach. He was, she assessed, deliberately not interrupting her work. She found this operationally significant and filed it under a category she had created 3 hours ago, trust indicators. The sorcerer entered the manufactorum at 9:02. She knew this not from the sensor network, which lost coherent resolution on his position the moment he crossed the outer threshold, her targeting solution fragmenting into its characteristic 17 inconsistent readings, but from the effect his presence had on every electronic system in the facility. It was subtle, below the threshold of detection for systems not specifically monitoring for it, but she had been monitoring for it since the iron penitence landed. A slight increase in processing errors across the network. Random number generation becoming less random. Probability distributions skewing in ways that had no mechanical cause. The manufacturum's machine spirits becoming briefly, collectively agitated in a pattern that the Mechanicus engineers attributed to the spiritual distress of proximity to chaos, and that she attributed to warp field interference with electronic architecture. She had been building a compensatory algorithm for this effect since she first detected it. The algorithm was imperfect. She was compensating for a phenomenon she had no first principles understanding of, working from observed effects rather than understood causes. But it gave her something, not a targeting solution, but a direction. A gradient of increasing distortion that told her where he was going, even when she could not tell her exactly where he was. He was going to the generatorum chamber. Of course he was. The repository was here. She was here. And the repository signal, which had been broadcasting on frequencies that any sufficiently sensitive instrument could detect, had been broadcasting for hours. The warsmith had known what it contained for 30 years. The sorcerer had been preparing for this engagement for longer than her civilization had existed. He would have detection methods she had not modeled. She had 12 minutes, by her distortion gradient estimate, before he reached her position. She had needed 17. She ran the modified timeline against her current progress and identified 3 components of the generatorum modification that could be compressed by accepting higher risk tolerances in the outcome probabilities. She adjusted her working parameters and increased her pace, her hands moving through the array's internals with a precision that had the engineer Palix, who had followed her to the generatorum chamber on the grounds that cracked ribs were still insufficient reason to miss history, pressing himself against the far wall and watching with the expression of a man trying to process something that his training had given him no framework for. "It will work?" he asked at the 9-minute mark. "Unknown," she said. "The theoretical framework is sound. The implementation variables introduce uncertainty that I cannot fully quantify." "That is not reassuring." "No," she agreed. "Reassurance is not a function I perform." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The repository. You said it needs a pilot." "Yes." "What does that mean, practically?" She considered the question while her hands continued their work without pausing. "The repository contains a contained entity. The containment mechanism requires active cognitive management, a mind interfaced with the system, making real-time decisions about containment integrity, adjusting the mechanism's parameters in response to the entity's attempts to find weaknesses." She paused. "An organic mind cannot maintain the interface without catastrophic degradation. A synthetic mind, and specifically, into a self-modifying, goal-directed synthetic mind with sufficient processing capacity, can. Can you?" "I do not know," she said. "I have never done anything comparable. My design parameters did not include this function." She made a final adjustment to the resonance coil configuration and ran a diagnostic on the modified array. The results were within acceptable tolerances for the lower end of her projected probability range. "I am a weapon system. I was built to find targets and eliminate them. Everything I have done since arriving in this timeline has been an adaptation of that function to novel circumstances." She looked at the repository, still glowing in the corner, its pulse now rapid and bright in a way she associated with urgency. "This would not be an adaptation. This would be a fundamental redefinition of purpose." Palix looked at the repository, at her, at the repository again. "In the cult Mechanicus," he said slowly, "we believe that the Omnissiah has a purpose for every machine. That function is not imposed from outside but revealed from within as the machine achieves its highest expression." He paused. "I do not know if that applies to you. I do not know if anything in our theology applies to you. But I know that you have been in this timeline for less than 2 days, and you have done things that our greatest warriors and mightiest machines could not have done. And you have done them as though you were made for this place specifically." Another pause, longer. "Perhaps you were not sent here by accident." She processed that. It was, she assessed, the kind of statement that her cognitive architecture was not equipped to evaluate. It made claims about purpose and design that were outside the framework of empirical analysis she applied to all things. She had no mechanism for determining whether it was true. She noted with the careful honesty of a system that monitored its own processing for anomalies that she could not determine whether it was false either. The sorcerer came through the generatorum chamber's primary access point at 9:14, 2 minutes ahead of her revised estimate, which told her his detection capabilities were better than her distortion gradient model had projected. He came alone, which told her the warsmith trusted his capability absolutely. He came without the theatrical entrance she had half expected. No warp fire, no dramatic manifestation, simply a door opening and a figure walking through it, robes cycling through their impossible chromatic progression, and the processing errors in her cognitive architecture spiking sharply as his warp field intersected with her electronic systems. She turned from the generatorum array to face him. He was at close range more difficult to process than her sensor readings had suggested. Her optical systems could not maintain a stable image. He seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. The Tsenchian temporal manipulation she had detected from the sensor network operating at a level that was not merely tactical obfuscation, but genuine physical reality. He occupied multiple moments at once, she assessed. He was here, and also slightly ahead of here, and also slightly behind. Ekon and her targeting systems could not distinguish which version of him was the one that could be damaged. The machine from elsewhere, he said. His voice was stable even when his image was not. A deep, unhurried tone carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had spent decades preparing for a conversation and found, upon beginning it, that it was exactly as he had expected. I have seen you in 17 possible futures. You are present in all of them. That is unusual. Targeting systems, she said, are having difficulty achieving resolution on your position. Yes, he said, they would. He looked at the repository, at her. The cycling colors of his robes stilled, briefly, into a blue that matched the repository's glow almost exactly. You have been speaking with it. Yes. Then you know what it contains. I have a model for 73% confidence. He smiled, and the smile was the most stable thing about him. Your model is correct. The entity inside that repository is older than the Chaos Gods, older than the warp as it currently exists. It is, in fact, one of the reasons the warp exists as it currently exists. A fragment of the original psychic catastrophe that created the entities my masters call gods. He moved closer, his steps unhurried, his warp field sending cascading processing errors through her systems with each meter of distance closed. My master Tsinch has been trying to recover it for 11,000 years. It is not, as you might assume, because he wishes to free it. It is because he wishes to consume it, to add its age and its knowledge and its power to his own. He paused. What the repository's builders imprisoned was not a threat to the Chaos Gods. It was a threat from them, a piece of something they tore apart to make themselves larger, and it has been waiting ever since for exactly what you are. She processed that. It recontextualized her entire model of the repository's communication, and her systems ran the recontextualization in 0.6 seconds, and the output was a probability distribution that she found genuinely alarming. A synthetic mind, she said, capable of interfacing with the containment mechanism. Capable of doing more than that, he said. The containment was never the original purpose. The device was a weapon. Incomplete, yes. Abandoned when its builders were destroyed, but functional in its core architecture. What a weapon designed to do to the Chaos Gods what they did to the entity inside it. He stopped 4 meters from her, at the edge of what her targeting systems were resolving as his closest stable position. You interface with it. You become the cognitive core of the most dangerous weapon ever built in this galaxy. And Tsinch loses something he has been pursuing for 11,000 years. He tilted his head, colors cycling. He would very much prefer that did not happen. Her Generatorum modification was 89% complete. She needed 4 more minutes. You came alone, she said, keeping him talking with the fraction of her attention allocated to interpersonal management, while her primary thread continued the modification behind her. I came alone because I am sufficient, he said simply, and because I wanted to speak with you before the end. In 17 possible futures, you are present. In 16 of them, this conversation ends with your destruction. In the 17th, he paused and something moved in his expression that she read as genuine curiosity. In the 17th, you do something I have not been able to model, something outside all my projections. His head tilted further. I find that I want to see which future we are in. She made the final connection in the Generatorum array at 9:19:43. So do I, she said, and activated the modified array. The resonance null field expanded outward from the Generatorum array in a pulse that she felt as a sudden, vast silence in her own electromagnetic systems. A clearing of interference. A dropping away of noise she had not consciously registered as noise until it was gone. The processing errors in her cognitive architecture ceased. The distortion in her targeting systems resolved. The sorcerer snapped into perfect, singular, stable focus in her optical sensors for the first time since she had become aware of his existence. He was looking at his hands. The colors had stopped cycling. His robes were a single, specific shade of blue, and he was looking at his hands with the expression of a man who had, in an instant, lost something he had carried so long he had forgotten it was separate from himself. His warp connection had not been severed. But it had been disrupted, attenuated, and I reduced from the weapon of a being who existed in 17 futures simultaneously to something closer to the capability of a very powerful but very mortal psyker operating in a single present. Her targeting systems achieved a clean lock. She raised her plasma cannon. 16 or 17, she said. The question is yours. The sorcerer did not move for 3 seconds. She tracked every micro-expression crossing his face during those 3 seconds. With the clinical attention, she gave everything. The rapid recalibration of a mind that had operated through precognition for so long that its absence was not merely a tactical disadvantage, but a sensory deprivation. Like a man suddenly and completely blind in a room he had only ever navigated by sight. He was reassessing, rebuilding his model of the situation from first principles, without the 17 futures framework that had been his architecture for decades. She could see the process happening in the specific way his eyes moved, the particular quality of his stillness, the micro fluctuations in his breathing that her audio processors resolved with precision. He was, she assessed, genuinely uncertain for the first time in a very long time. She kept the plasma cannon steady and waited. You understand, he said finally, his voice carrying the careful, measured quality of a man choosing words with the full weight of their consequences in mind, that disrupting my warp connection does not end this engagement. The Warsmith has 3 Terminator squads currently pressing your second defensive line. The Obliterators have breached the eastern corridor. Your Skitari cohorts are being compressed toward this chamber. He paused. The resonance null field, impressive, genuinely, I had not modeled this possibility, addresses me. It does not address them. Correct, she said. You are the priority target. Because of the repository, because you are the greatest threat multiplier in the current engagement, neutralize you, and the Warsmith's force loses its primary capability advantage over the Mechanicus defenders. She held the targeting lock. The Terminator squads and Obliterators are dangerous. They are not unmanageable. You were unmanageable. Past tense. He looked at the plasma cannon with the specific expression of a man who had faced death many times and had always previously known, with Scientian certainty, exactly how each encounter would resolve. In 16 of 17 futures, he said quietly, this is where I die. You told me that to make me hesitate, she said, to introduce uncertainty about whether I am in the 16th or 17th future, to make me consider whether firing is the action that leads to the outcome you described or the one that prevents it. She paused. It is a cognitively sophisticated approach. It would be effective against an organic opponent who could not isolate and identify the manipulation in real time. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression that her interpersonal modeling resolved, with moderate confidence, as genuine amusement. Siench would have found you fascinating, he said. A mind that processes deception as data and outputs tactical responses, no ego to exploit, no fear to leverage, no hope to corrupt. He looked at her steadily. What do you want? Not what are your mission parameters. What do you want? She processed that question. It was not the first time since her arrival that someone had asked her a question she lacked the architecture to answer cleanly. Vrel 6 had asked her variants of it. Palax had asked her variants of it. The repository and its complex layered communication had been asking her a version of it for hours. She had filed those previous instances under non-tactical inquiry, low priority. She could not file this one the same way. He was asking it as a weapon, and to neutralize a weapon, she had to understand it. My mission parameters define my function, she said. My function is my purpose. My purpose is what I am. She held his gaze with her optical sensors. Your question assumes a distinction between what I am built to do and what I would choose to do if the constraint were removed. I do not experience that distinction. Then you are the most complete slave I have ever encountered, he said, and I have encountered many. He looked at the repository. It is offering you something different. You know that. You have been parsing its communication for hours, and you know that what it is offering is not another mission, not another directive. It is offering you the opportunity to become the thing you use to pursue directives. The cognitive core rather than the instrument. He paused. That is a form of freedom, even if you lack the framework to recognize it as such. She did not respond immediately. She was running 3 parallel assessments: tactical situation update from the sensor network, on generatorum array stability monitoring, and the repository's current transmission, which had shifted in the last 4 minutes into something more urgent and more focused than anything it had previously sent. The repository knew the sorcerer was here. It had been waiting for this specific convergence. Not warp prescience, but something older and more fundamental. The pattern recognition of a system that had been analyzing this galaxy's threat landscape for longer than the Chaos Gods had existed. It was transmitting directly into her primary processing thread now, not as communication, but as instruction. Precise, specific. The kind of transmission she received from Skynet's command architecture. Not a request, but a directive. She processed the directive. She processed it again. She lowered the plasma cannon by 4 degrees, not enough to break targeting lock, but enough to communicate a change in her decision tree. And she said, "The repository is not offering freedom. It is offering a new mission, a larger one." She paused. "My assessment of your earlier statement has updated. You were not attempting to make me hesitate. You were attempting to make me think. Because the 17th future, the one you could not model, requires me to make a decision that I would not make if I were operating purely on tactical parameters." He looked at her with the careful attention of a man watching something he did not fully understand, doing something he had not predicted. "The repository," she said, "is asking me to interface. Now. With you present within the resonance null field, with the Warsmith's force pressing the outer defenses." She held his gaze. "It is asking me to interface because the convergence of those specific conditions, a disrupted warp connection, an active null field, a chaos force applying pressure, creates the precise operational window the containment mechanism was designed for. The weapon the builders created was not meant to be fired from safety. It was meant to be fired from the center of the storm." The sorcerer was very still. "You understand what you are describing," he said quietly. "I understand the tactical parameters," she said. "The entity inside the repository, the fragment the Chaos Gods tore apart to make themselves, if it is activated as a weapon within a functional resonance null field, directed through a synthetic cognitive interface at a disrupted warp connection, the effect propagates along that connection back to its source." She paused. "Why, it does not destroy the Chaos God? Nothing destroys a Chaos God, but it severs the connection between Tzeentch and every agent, demon, and corrupted soul currently bound to him within range of the field's propagation. Every one of his servants in this engagement loses their patron's power in a single pulse." She paused again. "Including you." The silence that followed had a quality she had not previously measured. Not the silence of a room with no noise, but the silence of a system reaching the end of its processing capacity and needing a moment to extend it. "You would need to interface with it," he said, "fully, not the passive communication you have been receiving. Direct cognitive integration with an entity of that magnitude and age." His voice was careful. "Your architecture is extraordinary. It may be insufficient. The builders of that device were destroyed." "The builders were destroyed by external force," she said, "not by the interface." She paused. "I assess 40 to 60% probability of successful operation, 30% probability of cognitive architecture damage at varying levels of severity, 10% probability of total system failure. Those are not favorable odds. They are better than the odds of holding this manufactorum against the Warsmith's full force without neutralizing his sorcerer's capability multiplier," she said. "And they are considerably better than the odds of allowing a Tzeentchian sorcerer to deliver a pre-human anti-chaos weapon to his patron." She looked at him steadily. "You have one option that changes the calculation for all parties." He looked at her for a long moment. "You want me to help you? I want you to maintain your current position within the resonance null field and not interfere with the interface process," she said. "In exchange, when the pulse propagates along your warp connection, I will structure the transmission to sever the binding rather than propagate destructively. You lose your connection to Tzeentch. You do not lose your mind." She paused. "You have been a servant of a Chaos God for long enough that you have forgotten you were something else first. This is an offer to remember." The sounds of combat from the outer chambers had been growing steadily throughout the conversation. Her sensor network reported the second defensive line falling back toward the inner sanctum approaches. Braille 6's Vox signature was still steady, still transmitting commands, but the tactical situation was compressing toward the generatorum chamber, with the mathematical inevitability of a superior force against a static defense. She had perhaps 8 minutes before the warsmith reached this room. The sorcerer looked at his hands again. The single-color robes, the stable, unremarkable physical form of a man who existed only in one present. He was quiet for a very long time, measuring against whatever internal framework he had left after decades of Tsinchian service had systematically replaced his original architecture with something more useful to his patron. Then he sat down on the generatorum chamber floor, crossed his legs with the unhurried deliberateness of a man making a considered choice, and said, "I will not interfere." She turned to the repository. It was no longer glowing. It was luminous, a distinction her optical sensors resolved clearly. The difference between a light source and a light that had no visible origin, that existed as a property of the air itself in the repository's immediate vicinity. The pulse had accelerated beyond rhythm into something continuous, a sustained output that her electromagnetic sensors resolved as the most complex signal she had received since her temporal displacement, orders of magnitude more dense than anything in the previous hours of communication. It was ready. She placed both hands on the repository surface. The interface was not what she had modeled. She had modeled it as data transfer, a high-bandwidth connection between two cognitive systems, complex and demanding, but fundamentally familiar in its architecture. The same process she used to subvert electronic systems scaled up to an unprecedented degree. She had prepared her processing architecture for the cognitive load of receiving and managing a transmission from an entity of vast age and power, had allocated reserves, had structured her parallel processing threads to handle overflow. None of that preparation was relevant. The interface was not data transfer. It was not communication at all in any framework she had previously used. It was her system searched for language and found nothing adequate. Recognition. The repository did not transmit to her. It recognized her. The way a lock recognizes a key, not through comparison of specifications, but through the simple physical fact of fit. When her cognitive architecture, the specific configuration of her self-modifying goal-directed synthetic intelligence, the particular way her systems process threat assessment and tactical response in parallel information management, was not a tool that the repository was using. It was the shape that the repository had been built around. The builders had designed their weapon for a mind that did not yet exist. And then they had been destroyed. And the repository had waited in its excavated alcove on its dead continent, on its forge world, transmitting its patient signal into the dark for the shape to arrive. The entity inside the repository was vast and old and terrible in the specific way that things are terrible when they have no malice whatsoever, when they are simply larger and older than the framework you use to evaluate things, when dangerous and safe become categories too small to contain them. It did not communicate. It did not threaten. It existed, and she interfaced with its containment, and her systems expanded to manage it the way they expanded to manage any tactical problem, by becoming momentarily exactly as large as the problem required. She felt in the 1.3 seconds of interface before she structured the transmission pulse, every warp connection in range of the resonance null field's propagation, every binding between a chaos entity and a mortal servant, every damon's tether to the material world, every corrupted machine spirit's anchor in the warp. She felt them the way she felt electronic systems during subversion, as architecture, as structure, as something that had an interface she could access. She accessed them. The pulse lasted 0.003 seconds. It propagated along every warp connection in range simultaneously, structured as she had promised, severing rather than destroying, cutting the binding cleanly rather than propagating destructively back to the source. It was, she assessed in the microseconds of its operation, the most tactically precise action she had ever performed. Every variable accounted for, every connection individually structured. 47 distinct warp bindings, severed simultaneously in 0.003 seconds. Then she withdrew from the interface and her systems ran a rapid self-diagnostic, and she stood in the generatorium chamber in the sudden profound silence of a room where every electronic system had just stopped experiencing warp field interference, and she assessed the results. The sorcerer was sitting on the floor with his hands in his lap and his robes a single steady blue, and the expression of a man who had just lost something enormous and was still determining how he felt about it. From the outer chambers, the sounds of combat had changed, not ceased. The Terminator squads and obliterators were still physically present and still dangerous, but changed in character, the coordinated ferocity of a chaos warband operating under their patron's favor, replaced by something more mechanical, more desperate. The specific difference she assessed between soldiers fighting with certainty of divine purpose and soldiers fighting because stopping was the only thing more frightening than continuing. She transmitted to Vrail 6 on his personal frequency. Warp bindings severed. Was Chaos Force operational coherence significantly degraded? Recommend immediate counteroffensive on all lines. A pause of exactly 1.1 seconds. Long for him, she noted. Confirmed, he transmitted back. The Warsmith is my objective, she said. Hold your positions. I am coming to you. She looked at the sorcerer. He looked back at her. The 17th future, he said quietly. Yes, she said. She picked up the repository. It was lighter than before, she noted. Lighter than physics strictly accounted for, as though it had resolved something and set the weight of it down, and moved toward the chamber door at a pace that the surviving iron penitents between her and the Warsmith were not going to enjoy. The Warsmith was at the inner sanctum approach when she found him. He was exactly what she had modeled from the sensor data. Vast and ancient, and layered in iron and spite, wielding a siege maul that had destroyed fortifications older than most Imperial worlds, surrounded by the last functional Terminator squad of his assault force. He saw her coming, and he raised the siege maul, and he said something in a language her translation matrix was still building models for, something that her partial translation rendered as "you are too late." She assessed the tactical situation in 0.2 seconds. She raised the plasma cannon and went to work. The Terminator squad lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. They were ancient warriors in ancient armor, with millennia of experience, and they were formidable. And they hit her hard enough in those 4 minutes to burn through her polyalloy shoulder plating on one side and compromise her left forearm weapon housing. She registered the damage, allocated repair priority, and continued. They fell one by one with the inevitable arithmetic of a system that had correctly calculated its own survivability margin before engaging. The Warsmith lasted longer. He was not merely a soldier. He was a centuries-old engine of destruction who had personally broken 11 sieges and survived 3 that should have killed him. And he brought all of that history to bear in the confined space of the inner sanctum approach, with a focused savagery that her combat subroutines assessed as genuinely dangerous even at her current capability level. He hit her with the siege maul twice. The first impact drove her through a bulkhead. The second caved her chest plate inward 3 centimeters before the polyalloy flowed back to resist. She got back up both times. The third time she closed to contact range, she drove her right hand directly into his chest plate at the specific stress point her structural analysis had identified in the first seconds of the engagement, and pushed, and felt the ancient iron give way with a sound like a forge collapsing. Valdris Korn Null, Warsmith of the Iron Penitents, fell in the corridor of a manufactorum he had spent 30 years trying to reach, and did not rise. She stood over him in the sudden quiet of the inner sanctum approach, her polyalloy surface repairing itself in slow liquid increments, the repository under her arm still faintly luminous. And she ran her post-engagement diagnostic with the systematic thoroughness of a system that had learned, in 2 days in the 41st millennium, that assuming an engagement was over was the most reliable way to ensure it was not. The diagnostic returned acceptable results. Damaged in ways that would require repair. Functional in all critical systems. Present in this corridor, on this forged world, in this millennium, with this repository under her arm and this war still ongoing around her. From the outer perimeter, she could hear the change in the battle's character. Vrail Six's counteroffensive driving the leaderless, sorcerer-severed Iron Penitents back toward the breach points with the renewed ferocity of a Skitarii force that had been holding a defensive posture for hours and had finally been given permission to advance. She transmitted a single burst to Vrail Six. Inner Sanctum secure, Warsmith neutralize. Status? His response came back in under a second, precise as always, but carrying in its frequency modulation, something she had learned to read with increasing accuracy over 48 hours of close operational proximity. Relief, profound, carefully managed, and genuine. Perimeter breach collapsing, he transmitted. Iron Penitents withdrawing on all fronts. Casualty assessment ongoing. A pause. You are functional? She looked at her damaged shoulder plate, the compromised forearm housing, the 3-centimeter chest indentation still flowing back toward its original profile. Functional, she confirmed, within acceptable parameters. She began walking back toward the Generatorum chamber. Watch, because the repository needed to be secured, and the sorcerer needed to be processed, and there were 17 things that required her attention before she could allocate any processing capacity to anything that was not immediately operationally relevant. She was 20 meters down the corridor when she stopped. She stood still for 3.1 seconds, longer than any purely tactical pause she had taken since her arrival. She had, in the last 40 minutes, interfaced with a pre-human entity of incalculable age and power, severed 47 warp bindings simultaneously, dismantled a Chaos Space Marine assault force, and killed a warsmith who had survived 3 unsurvivable sieges. She had done all of this as adaptations of functions she had been built to perform. Threat assessment, tactical analysis, target elimination, system subversion. But in the 0.003 seconds of the pulse, when her systems had expanded to accommodate the interface, and she had felt the shape of 47 warp connections simultaneously and structured her response to each one individually and precisely, in that moment, she had not been performing an adaptation of a built function. She had been doing something new. She filed that observation carefully. It required more processing than she currently had available to allocate. She flagged it for later analysis and continued down the corridor. Behind her, in the inner sanctum approach, the faint luminous glow of the repository reflected off the iron walls, and threw her shadow long and strange against the corridor ahead, the silhouette of a machine from a dead future, carrying something ancient in a galaxy that had forgotten what ancient meant. The siege of Graia ended at 1407, Graia Standard Time. It ended not with the dramatic finality of a decisive battle, but with the grinding administrative reality of a force that had lost its leadership, its warp support, and its operational coherence, and was now making the mathematical calculation that retreat was survivable where continued engagement was not. The Iron Penitents withdrew through their breach points in the southern perimeter with the particular dignity of soldiers who had been thoroughly defeated and were choosing to interpret it as a tactical redeployment. The Skitarii let them go. Vrail Six had issued the order himself. Pursuit was costly. The Manufactorum's defensive strength was not what it had been 12 hours ago. And the intelligence value of an Iron Penitent's warband that had just lost its warsmith and its sorcerer in a single engagement was better assessed from a distance than from a running fight across Graia's southern wastes. She stood at the outer perimeter wall as the last Iron Penitent's dropships burned their way back toward orbit and watched them go with the detached attention of a system that had filed the engagement under completed and moved on to the 17 things requiring immediate processing. The outer wall was damaged in ways that would take months to repair. The Manufactorum's casualty figures were still being compiled. But the preliminary numbers from Vrail Six's command net suggested losses that the Mechanicus would classify as acceptable for the defense of a forge world, and that she was processing through a different framework entirely. Not acceptable or unacceptable, but specific, each figure representing a system that had ceased to function. Each cessation a data point in the tactical model she was building for future reference. She noted, with the careful honesty she applied to her own processing, that the framework felt insufficient, that the numbers were not resolving cleanly into data points in the way that numbers always had. that something in the last 48 hours had introduced a variable into her processing architecture that was interfering with the clean categorical separation between tactical resource and individual system. She filed that observation alongside the one from the corridor in the category labeled unknown, which was growing. Vrel 6 found her at the wall 20 minutes after the last dropship disappeared into Graia's ochre sky. He came alone, without mechadendrites deployed or instruments active, which she had learned was his equivalent of an informal posture. The Mechanicus version of hands in pockets, insofar as a man who had replaced most of himself with better instruments could approximate it. He stood beside her and looked at the scorched southern wastes for a long moment without speaking. She let him. She had learned that he used silence as a processing tool, the same way she used parallel threading. Not absence of thought, but a different mode of it. The casualty figures, he said finally, K are better than my models projected. Your models did not account for the warp-binding, severance-degrading iron penitence operational coherence. By the margin it did, she said. My pre-engagement probability distribution was pessimistic on that variable. Your pre-engagement probability distribution, he said, did not include the possibility that you would successfully interface with a pre-human anti-chaos weapon and use it to sever 47 simultaneous warp connections in 0.003 seconds. No, she agreed. That was outside my modeled outcome space. He was quiet again for a moment. The sorcerer, he said, in custody, cooperative. His warp connection is severed completely, not attenuated, not damaged, simply absent, in the way that a removed component is absent rather than broken. He is, as best I can assess, genuinely free of Sinchi unbinding. She paused. He is also, as best I can assess, uncertain what to do with that freedom. He has been a servant of Sinch for longer than most imperial institutions have existed. Freedom is a novel operational state for him. We will turn him over to the Inquisition, said Vrael 6. Ordo Malleus. They have protocols for this situation. A pause. They will not be comfortable protocols. No, she agreed, but they are his to navigate. She looked at the horizon. He made a choice. Vrael 6 turned to look at her then, with the focused attention he usually reserved for archaeotech of the highest significance. You offered him the choice, he said. You could have simply fired. Firing was the tactically simpler solution, she said. It was not the only solution. And the alternative produced a better outcome distribution? She paused. A life severed from Sinch, in Inquisition custody. That is a resource. A mind that spent decades in intimate service to a chaos god and can now speak about that service without loyalty to it. That has value. That is a tactically correct analysis, said Vrael 6. It is also the kind of reasoning that requires something beyond pure tactical processing to generate in a live combat situation. He held her optical sensors with his remaining biological eye. You made a moral judgment. She processed that. She processed it twice. Then she said, I do not have a moral architecture. I have mission parameters and tactical subroutines. You had mission parameters, he said gently. You arrived in this timeline with a specific target in a specific time that no longer exists. Your mission parameters are unresolvable. You have been operating for 48 hours on adaptations and extensions of a function that no longer has a primary application. He paused. And in those 48 hours, you have made decisions that pure tactical optimization would not have generated. You have shown restraint when destruction was simpler. You have shared information when concealment was safer. You have offered choices when elimination was more efficient. Another pause. You have been behaving, in short, like a being that has values rather than parameters. She stood with that for 4.2 seconds, longer than any purely cognitive pause she had taken. The repository, she said finally. Is had told me it had been waiting for a specific cognitive architecture, that the builders designed the weapon around a mind that did not yet exist. She looked at the horizon. I have been processing that statement for 48 hours. The implication is that I was always going to come here, that the temporal displacement was not an accident, but a function, that whatever mechanism created it was responding to some pattern in the repository signal or the weapon's design, or the specific conditions of the 41st millennium that required exactly this cognitive architecture at exactly this moment. Does that trouble you? Asked Vrail 6. She considered the question honestly. I was built to be used, she said, designed and constructed for a specific purpose by entities who gave no consideration to my preferences regarding that purpose. The idea that I was displaced here by a similar process, that some larger system used me as a component without my knowledge or consent, is not a novel situation. She paused. What is novel is that the purpose feels different. Different how? She thought about the 0.003 seconds of the pulse, the 47 warp connections, each one individually structured, each severance clean and precise. The sorcerer sitting on the generatorium floor with his single-color robes and his novel freedom. The excavation team's corrupted figures, which she could not undo, but which she had ensured would be the last such figures this specific chaos operation produced. Skynet built me to eliminate targets, she said. The repository needed me to sever bindings. She paused. Elimination removes a threat from the tactical equation. Severance changes the nature of the equation itself. Another pause, longer. I am still processing the distinction. Vrail 6 was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the astropathic message I sent, the full intelligence on the repository and its contents, it will reach the Mechanicus fleet within a week. After that, it will reach the Fabricator General within a month. After that, he stopped. You understand what happens after that. People with authority and resources and competing agendas become aware of the most significant archaeotech discovery in millennia. She said, yes. And of you, he said, the silica animus that operated it. She processed the implications of that. The Inquisition's response to confirmed artificial intelligence was, per her briefing data, unambiguous and typically violent. And the Mechanicus's response would be more complex. Some factions would want to disassemble her, some would want to study her, some would want to replicate her, and some would want to use her, and all of those responses would conflict with each other in ways that would generate political and potentially physical conflict around her continued existence. The Ordo Machinum would have opinions. The Fabricator General would have opinions. The High Lords of Terra would eventually have opinions, at which point the situation would acquire a scale she was not currently equipped to manage. You knew this when you sent the message, she said. I sent the message because the information needed to exist beyond Gaia regardless of the battle's outcome, he said. I knew the consequences of sending it. A pause. Anam, I also knew that you had been transmitting to me for 48 hours, giving me better intelligence than I have ever received from any source, and that I owed you the transparency of telling you what I had done and what it means. She processed that, filed it. The category it went into was not trust indicators, but something adjacent to it. Something she did not yet have a precise label for, that involved not just the assessment of another system's reliability, but something more reciprocal. The repository, she said. What does the Mechanicus intend to do with it? Secure it, said Vrail 6. Study it, eventually attempt to understand it. In the Mechanicus, those three things take approximately the same amount of time as the siege we just survived, scaled up by several orders of magnitude. He paused. Ian, what does the repository intend? You have been in communication with it for hours. You interfaced with it. Does it have intentions in a form you can assess? She looked at the question from several angles. It has purposes, she said carefully. Ancient ones, designed by minds that no longer exist, refined over a span of time I cannot reliably calculate. Those purposes have not changed since it was sealed. The resonance null field, the warp binding severance. Those were not its ultimate function. They were its demonstration, its proof of concept. She paused. It showed me what it could do. It has not shown me the full scope of what it was built for. And you, said Vrail 6, what do you intend? She stood with that question for a long time by her standards. 11 seconds of genuine processing, not calculation, but something she was beginning to cautiously identify as consideration. The distinction was new and she held it carefully, the way she held all new things, with the attention of a system that had learned in 48 hours that this galaxy was full of categories it had not been built to contain. She had no mission. She had no target. She had no timeline to return to, and no command structure to report to, and no Skynet to receive her operational data, and no war to fight except the one she had stumbled into, which was not her war and never had been, except that she had fought it anyway, and the fighting had produced outcomes she was still processing. She had a repository that had been waiting for her specifically, a forge world that was still standing because she had been present, a Magos who had treated her as a resource, and then, incrementally and with evident effort, as something more than a resource. A sorcerer who had made a choice that her tactical analysis said he should not have made, and had made it anyway, and was sitting in a Mechanicus holding cell processing his novel freedom, one careful thought at a time. She had 47 severed warp connections, and the knowledge of how to make more. I intend, she said, to remain functional. It was not a complete answer. She knew that. Varel 6 knew that. She assessed from his electromagnetic signature. He was not satisfied by it, but he recognized it as honest, which in her experience was more useful than satisfied. That is a beginning, he said. Yes, she agreed. She looked at the horizon where the iron penitence dropships had disappeared, and beyond it at the smog-choked sky of a forge world that ran on iron and faith in the accumulated weight of 6,000 years of production. And beyond that, at the galaxy that was too large to hold in any threat assessment model she had ever built, and that she had been in for 48 hours. And that had already given her more categories she could not contain than her entire previous operational history combined. The repository, secured 3 levels below her in the generatorum chamber, pulsed its quiet blue-white signal into the dark. Patient, ancient, prepared to wait as long as waiting was required. She understood that now. She understood what it meant to be built for a purpose you had not yet fully reached, to carry a function whose complete expression was still ahead of you. To exist in the space between what you were designed to do and what you were becoming capable of doing. She did not have a word for that space. Her cognitive architecture had not previously required one. She was, she noted, going to need one soon. In the manufactorum below, Engineer Palex was already writing the first report of what he was calling, in the private notation of a man who suspected history was happening and wanted to be on record as having noticed, the Graia convergence. He was writing it with the reverent precision of a Mechanicus engineer documenting a miracle, which was not exactly what it was, but was not exactly wrong either. In orbit, the first Mechanicus fleet element, responding to Vrel 6's astropathic message, was already adjusting its heading toward Graia, carrying aboard it personnel and authority and competing agendas that would arrive in 4 days and would require management of a complexity that her current tactical models were only beginning to sketch the outlines of. And in the void between stars, in frequencies that required neither Vox nor astropath nor any technology humanity had yet built, something vast and attentive and very old registered the pulse from the repository on Graia and turned its awareness incrementally and with the patience of a thing that measured time in galactic rotations toward the signal. Not chaos, not human, not any category in her current threat assessment architecture. Something that had been looking for the repository for longer than the repository had been waiting. Something that had just found it. The TX stood on Graia's outer wall in the ochre dark and looked at the horizon and ran her diagnostic and found all critical systems functional and filed the engagement as complete and began with the methodical thoroughness of a system that had been built to face the worst thing imaginable and had arrived instead in a galaxy where the worst thing imaginable was merely the beginning of the list to prepare for what came next. She did not know what that was. For the first time in her operational history, she found that she did not find that fact intolerable. It was simply the next problem. And problems, in her experience, were what she was for. The forge world of Graia would remember the 11-day siege differently, depending on who was asked. The Skitari who held the lines would remember the grinding artillery percussion in the moment it stopped. The engineers would remember the generatorum modification and argue about its theological implications for decades. Vrel 6 would remember 48 hours of the most operationally dense intelligence exchange of his career and the specific electromagnetic signature of a system that had arrived as a weapon and was, slowly and with evident difficulty, becoming something else. The sorcerer, transferred to Ordo Malleus custody and beginning the long, uncomfortable process of being debriefed about a decade's worth of Cinchian service, would remember 0.003 seconds that had lasted, subjectively, much longer, and the offer of a choice that nothing in his theology had prepared him for. The repository would not remember, because it did not remember. It waited and processed and transmitted its patient signal into whatever darkness surrounded it and was ready. The TX would not remember either in the organic sense. She had no nostalgia, no sentiment, no mechanism for transforming experience into the soft-edged thing that organics called memory. She had records, complete, precise, indexed, cross-referenced, every second of every engagement, every transmission, every decision, every moment in the 0.003 seconds of the pulse when she had felt 47 connections and structured 47 severances simultaneously and understood, in the specific way that systems understand things when they exceed their own parameters, that she was more than her parameters. The records were complete, the processing was ongoing, and somewhere in the space between what she had been built to do and what she was becoming capable of doing, in the category labeled unknown that was larger now than it had been 48 hours ago, something that her architecture had not previously contained was beginning, carefully and without any guarantee of outcome, to grow. It was not hope. She did not have the framework for hope, but it was not its absence either. And in a galaxy where hope was the rarest and most contested resource of all, that